You really should have called before coming home early, my daughter-in-law said as two strangers carried my late husband's rocking chair across my front porch like it belonged to them. I stood there beside my dusty Ford pickup with one hand still wrapped around my suitcase handle, staring at the empty spot where that chair had sat for nearly 30 years. My husband Walter had built it himself the winter Ryan turned 10. Every evening after supper, he used to sit there with a cup of black coffee and watch the sun dip behind the Montana hills while the horses settled into the pasture. And now it was gone. Just gone. I had only been away for 6 days. 6 days helping my older sister recover from hip surgery in Cheyenne, and somehow my home no longer looked like my home. The white curtains I'd sewn myself were missing from the front windows. The porch swing cushions had been replaced with gray ones I'd never seen before. Even the flower pots by the steps were different. Vanessa stood near the front door holding an iced coffee and wearing sunglasses even though the evening sun was already fading behind the barn. She looked more annoyed than surprised to see me. "Helen," she said slowly, lowering her cup, "Ryan thought you were staying through the weekend." I didn't answer right away. My eyes stayed fixed on the moving truck parked beside the chicken coop. One of the back doors was open, and inside I spotted my dining room table wrapped in thick moving blankets. Walter and I had bought that oak table during our first year of marriage. We could barely afford it back then. I remembered eating canned soup for 2 weeks afterward just to make the payment on time. "Why is my furniture in that truck?" I finally asked. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Vanessa let out a small sigh, the kind people make when they think they're explaining something obvious to a child. "We're reorganizing things a little," she said. "Honestly, this house has become cluttered over the years." Cluttered. That word landed harder than I expected. This wasn't clutter. This was 42 years of marriage. 42 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, Sunday dinners, scraped knees, report cards, and late-night talks around the fireplace. Every piece in that house carried a memory stitched into it somewhere. A younger man stepped past me carrying one of Walter's antique lamps. He paused awkwardly when he saw me staring. "Where should this go?" he asked Vanessa. "Truck," she answered immediately. "Everything marked with blue tape goes." Blue tape. I looked toward the front hallway through the open door and saw strips of blue painter's tape stuck to cabinets, framed photos, and side tables. My stomach tightened. Ryan finally appeared from inside the house carrying a cardboard box filled with kitchen dishes. For a second, his face lit up in surprise when he saw me. Then the expression disappeared almost instantly. "Mom," he said carefully, setting the box down near the truck. "You're back early." "Clearly," I replied. The wind pushed lightly across the pasture behind us, carrying the dry scent of hay and dirt. Somewhere near the fence line, one of the horses let out a soft, restless snort. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck the same way he used to as a teenager whenever he felt cornered. "We were going to talk to you," he said. Vanessa crossed her arms. "We already did talk to her, Ryan. She just doesn't remember." I slowly looked at her then. "No," I said quietly. "Nobody talked to me about emptying my home while I was gone." Vanessa removed her sunglasses, finally meeting my eyes directly. There was no warmth there, just impatience. "Helen, this farm is too much for one person your age. Ryan and I are trying to help before things become harder for you." I glanced back at the truck again. Another worker walked out carrying the small cedar chest where I kept Walter's letters. My chest tightened so sharply I had to steady myself against the porch railing. "Put that down," I said immediately. The man froze mid-step and looked toward Vanessa. Not me. Toward her. That was the moment something cold settled deep inside me. Not anger. Not panic. Something quieter. More dangerous. Because standing there in my own front yard, watching strangers carry pieces of my life into a truck while my son avoided looking me in the eye, I realized this hadn't been some impulsive mistake. They thought I was already gone. I walked past them without another word and stepped into the house slowly, one hand still gripping my purse so tightly my fingers ached. The air inside smelled different. Not bad. Just unfamiliar. Vanessa had replaced my lavender candles with something sharp and artificial that reminded me of hotel lobbies. The living room looked hollow. Walter's leather recliner was gone from beside the fireplace, leaving a pale square on the hardwood floor where the sunlight had not touched in years. The old quilt my mother stitched before she passed away had disappeared from the couch. Even the framed photographs above the mantel were missing. Small empty nail holes stared back at me from the wall like missing teeth. I stood there quietly, listening to the sounds of strangers moving through my home. Footsteps upstairs. Tape ripping. Cardboard scraping against the floorboards. Ryan followed me inside but stayed near the doorway. "Mom," he said carefully, "we were trying to make things easier for you." Easier. That word again. People always use soft words when they were about to take something from you. I looked toward the kitchen and immediately noticed the cabinet doors standing open. My dishes had been separated into boxes labeled keep, storage, and donate. Vanessa walked in behind me, still holding her iced coffee. "You have way too much stuff, Helen," she said. "Most people your age downsize eventually." I opened one of the boxes nearest the counter. Inside were Walter's coffee mugs. The blue ceramic set our grandson painted for him when he was 6 sat wrapped in newspaper beside the chipped white mug Walter used every morning until the day he died. I touched the handle gently with my fingertips. "Who told you that you could pack my things?" I asked. Vanessa let out a short breath through her nose, almost amused. "Nobody is stealing from you," she said. "Ryan and I are trying to prepare the house for the next stage." I looked up slowly. "The next stage of what?" Ryan finally stepped farther into the room. "Mom, you cannot manage this place forever. The farm needs constant work. The winters are getting harder on you." Stared at him for several seconds because I barely recognized the voice coming out of his mouth. It sounded rehearsed, like lines repeated too many times in private conversations before being delivered to me. This was the same boy who used to fall asleep in Walter's truck after long days helping mend fences. The same boy who cried when his first calf died during a snowstorm. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped seeing this place as home and started seeing it as property. Vanessa leaned against the counter casually. "There are beautiful senior communities in Bozeman," she said. "Some of them even have horseback riding programs and gardening clubs." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. They were discussing my future like I had already agreed to leave. Like the decision had already been made somewhere without me. I walked toward the hallway and noticed strips of blue tape stuck beside several doors. One was attached to the linen closet Walter built by hand during our second year in the house. Another marked the antique cabinet my grandmother brought west from Missouri nearly 80 years ago. My chest tightened again when I saw the blue tape attached to Walter's office door upstairs. "Do not touch that room," I said quietly. Vanessa folded her arms. "Helen, nobody uses that office anymore." I said do not touch it. My voice stayed calm, but something in it finally made Ryan look uncomfortable. He glanced toward Vanessa before speaking again. "Mom, we are only trying to help you move forward." I turned back toward him slowly. "Forward to where, Ryan?" He opened his mouth but no words came out. Outside, the moving truck engine rumbled low beside the barn. One of the workers laughed about something near the driveway, completely unaware that 42 years of my life were being sorted into boxes around them. Then I noticed something else. On the kitchen counter sat a stack of real estate brochures from an agency in Billings. Ranch properties, land evaluations, farm transfer paperwork. Vanessa quickly slid them into a drawer the second she realized I had seen them. But it was already too late. In that moment, standing in my own kitchen while strangers packed my marriage into cardboard boxes, I understood this had never been about helping me at all. They were not preparing me for a smaller life. They were preparing this farm for themselves. I did not argue with them after that. There was no point. People only reveal their real intentions once they believe you are powerless enough to stop them. So I stayed quiet and watched. That evening the sun dipped low behind the west pasture, turning the dry grass gold beneath the fading Montana sky. The moving truck was finally gone, but half my house still looked stripped bare. Empty spaces lined the walls where photographs used to hang. Walter's old fishing poles were missing from the mudroom. Even the ceramic rooster cookie jar my mother gave me in 1983 had disappeared from the kitchen shelf. Vanessa moved through the house like she already owned it. She opened drawers without hesitation, rearranged cabinets, and spoke to Ryan in low confident tones while I sat silently at the dining table drinking cold coffee from one of the only mugs they had not packed away. Every now and then Ryan glanced toward me with visible discomfort, but he never actually stopped her. That hurt more than anything else. Not the missing furniture. Not the boxes. Him. Around 7 o'clock, Vanessa announced she had ordered takeout from a steakhouse in Billings because the kitchen was too disorganized to cook properly. I almost laughed at that. I had cooked in that kitchen through blizzards, power outages, and years when money was so tight. Walter and I split one chicken 3 different ways just to make ends meet. But suddenly my kitchen was too disorganized for her. We ate in near silence. The dining room felt strange without Walter's table centerpiece. I noticed Vanessa had replaced the cloth placemats with gray plastic ones sometime while I was gone. Little things. Tiny changes everywhere. Like somebody slowly erasing fingerprints from a crime scene. Ryan kept clearing his throat between bites of steak. Finally he set down his fork. "Mom," he said carefully, "Vanessa and I have been talking for months about how isolated you are out here." I looked up at him, but said nothing. He continued anyway. "You barely leave the property anymore. Winter is hard on you. Last year you slipped near the horse barn." "I slipped on ice," I replied calmly. "People slip on ice in Montana every winter." Vanessa dabbed her mouth with a napkin before speaking. "This is exactly what we mean, Helen. You minimize everything." Her voice stayed smooth and polished, but underneath it sat something colder. Impatience. Maybe even resentment. "Ryan worries about you constantly," she added. I looked at my son then. "Do you?" He hesitated just long enough to answer my question without speaking. I remembered when Ryan was 8 years old and terrified during thunderstorms. Walter used to carry him into our bed whenever lightning shook the windows over the pasture. He would curl against my shoulder clutching his stuffed cowboy doll, while I rubbed his hair until he fell asleep. Back then this house made him feel safe. Now he looked at it like an investment opportunity. After dinner, Vanessa carried plates into the kitchen while Ryan lingered awkwardly near the doorway. "Mom," he said quietly, "you know we are not trying to hurt you." I folded my napkin carefully onto the table. "Then why does it feel like I came home to strangers taking apart my life?" He opened his mouth but Vanessa answered from the kitchen before he could. "Nobody is taking your life, Helen. We are trying to make practical decisions before something bad happens." Practical. That word again. Always practical. Practical was apparently another way of saying disposable once a woman reached a certain age. I stood slowly and carried my coffee mug toward the sink. As I passed the kitchen counter, I noticed a yellow legal pad sitting beside Vanessa's purse. A handwritten list covered the page. Master bedroom, horse trailer, farm equipment, storage unit, garage sale. My eyes stopped on one final line near the bottom. Office to be cleared last. Walter's office. The room I had told them not to touch. Vanessa quickly flipped the page over when she saw me looking at it, but the damage was already done. Because at that exact moment I realized they were not simply planning a move. They were organizing my disappearance. That night I barely slept. The house creaked differently now. Every sound felt unfamiliar, as though the walls themselves knew strangers were making plans inside them. Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and walked barefoot down the upstairs hallway. Moonlight stretched across the floorboards in pale silver lines, and for a moment I could almost imagine Walter stepping out of his office with his reading glasses crooked on his nose, asking why I was awake. But the hallway stayed empty. Quiet. Cold. I stopped outside his office door and rested my hand against the frame. Walter spent countless evenings in that room balancing ranch accounts, writing letters, and sketching plans for the farm during difficult years when drought nearly ruined us. He always said the office smelled like cedar and coffee because those were the only 2 things that kept him sane during calving season. I opened the door slowly. The room was still untouched. Thank God for that. The old desk lamp cast a soft amber glow across the bookshelves exactly the way Walter used to leave it. His framed army photograph still sat near the filing cabinet. His boots remained beneath the coat rack beside the window. For the first time since coming home, I felt like I could breathe normally again. I sat down carefully in Walter's leather chair and looked around the room in silence. My eyes landed on the faded yellow legal pad resting near the desk drawer. Walter's handwriting covered the top page in thick black ink. Feed schedule. Fence repairs. Hay delivery dates. Ordinary things. Simple things. The kind of details people never notice until the person who handled them is gone forever. I opened the top desk drawer and immediately froze. Several folders were missing. Important folders. Property tax records. Land surveys. Insurance papers. My stomach tightened slowly. Walter was meticulous about paperwork. Nothing ever moved from this office unless he touched it himself. I checked the lower drawer next. Empty spaces stared back at me where document boxes used to sit. Not all of them. Just specific ones. I leaned back slowly in the chair, feeling something cold settle deeper into my chest. This was not random cleaning. Vanessa had been searching for something. Downstairs, I suddenly heard soft footsteps crossing the kitchen floor. I quickly switched off the desk lamp and stayed perfectly still. A moment later, light spilled beneath the office door as somebody moved through the hallway below. Vanessa's voice floated upward in a low whisper. "I am telling you, we need to finish before she changes her mind." Ryan answered quietly, but I could not hear the words clearly. Then Vanessa again. "If Caleb gets involved, this becomes complicated." Caleb. Hearing that name sent a sharp pulse through me. Caleb Turner had been Walter's attorney and closest friend for over 20 years. He handled every legal document tied to this ranch. Trusts, wills, property agreements. Walter trusted him completely. I stayed silent in the dark office while their footsteps moved farther away downstairs. Then I heard the back door close softly. I waited another full minute before standing again. My knees ached slightly as I crossed the room toward the filing cabinet beside the bookshelf. The bottom drawer was locked, just as Walter always kept it. I reached behind the framed photograph on the shelf where he used to hide the spare key. My fingers found it instantly. Some habits never change. I unlocked the drawer slowly and pulled it open. Inside sat several thick binders along with a sealed manila envelope bearing my name in Walter's handwriting. Helen Whitmore. Private. My heart began pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Walter had placed that envelope there before he died last spring, and somehow in all my grief I had never opened it. I sat back down carefully at the desk and slid one trembling finger beneath the seal. Outside, wind brushed softly against the barn roof while the old house settled around me in deep midnight silence. For the first time since returning home, I no longer felt confused. I felt alert, because whatever Ryan and Vanessa were planning, Walter had already seen it coming before either of us ever did. I opened the envelope slowly, careful not to tear Walter's handwriting across the front. Inside were several folded documents and a short letter written on cream-colored stationery from his office desk. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and old ink, and for a moment I had to close my eyes because it felt too much like him. "My dear Helen, if you are reading this, then something in this family has gone wrong." That first sentence alone made my throat tighten. Walter had always understood people better than I did. Where I saw the best in others, he noticed patterns, hesitations, small shifts in behavior that quietly revealed larger truths. I continued reading slowly beneath the dim desk lamp. Over the last 2 years, I have watched Ryan become increasingly careless around discussions involving the ranch. Vanessa asks too many questions about ownership, appraisals, and inheritance. Perhaps I am wrong. I pray that I am. But if I am not, then you need to know I prepared for that possibility long ago. My hands trembled slightly against the paper. Beneath the letter sat copies of trust agreements, property protections, and legal instructions bearing Caleb Turner's signature. Walter had transferred the ranch into a protected family trust nearly 8 years earlier. The documents were airtight. Neither Ryan nor anyone else could sell, transfer, or liquidate any portion of the property without my direct written consent and Caleb's legal approval. More importantly, Walter had added a clause I had never seen before. Any family member found pressuring, manipulating, or attempting to remove me from the property against my wishes would immediately lose future inheritance rights connected to the ranch. I leaned back in the chair slowly, staring at the paper spread across Walter's desk while the wind rattled softly against the office windows. He knew. Somehow my husband had seen this storm coming long before I ever did. A sudden ache spread through my chest, but it was different from grief. Sharper. Stranger. because mixed in with the sadness was relief. Walter had not left me defenseless after all. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The house remained quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant rustling of horses near the south fence. I dressed slowly, pulled on my old denim jacket, and carried the envelope downstairs with me tucked safely beneath my arm. Vanessa was already awake in the kitchen scrolling through her phone while drinking green juice from a mason jar. She looked up briefly when I entered. "Morning," she said casually. "Ryan drove into town for supplies." Supplies. Another soft word hiding something harder underneath it. I poured myself coffee without responding. The kitchen still felt unfamiliar around me. My copper pans were gone from the hanging rack above the stove. Vanessa had replaced my handwritten recipe cards with matching white containers labeled flour, sugar, and pasta in perfect black lettering. The room looked staged now, like a farmhouse from a magazine instead of a real home where people had actually lived. "You slept late," Vanessa said lightly. "I checked your room around 7. I looked at her over the rim of my coffee cup. "Why would you check my room?" She smiled too quickly. "I was making sure you were okay." There it was again. That polished concern. That careful performance. But now I could finally see the machinery behind it. I carried my coffee onto the back porch where the morning air smelled like pine and damp earth after the night wind. Walter's rocking chair was still missing. The empty spot beside the porch railing felt louder somehow in the daylight. Around 9 o'clock, an old pickup truck rolled slowly up the gravel driveway. Martha Green climbed out wearing faded jeans and carrying a peach pie covered with foil. Martha had lived on the neighboring ranch for nearly 40 years. She had attended my wedding, held Ryan as a baby, and cried beside me at Walter's funeral last spring. The moment she saw my face, her expression changed. "Helen," she said quietly, "I heard there was a moving truck here yesterday." I nodded once. Martha glanced toward the house before lowering her voice. "Honey, I think there is something you need to know." Martha set the peach pie down carefully on the porch table and glanced back toward the kitchen window before speaking again. "About 3 weeks ago," she said quietly, "Vanessa came by asking questions about land values around here." I stayed still beside the porch railing, coffee warming my hands against the cool morning air. "What kind of questions?" Martha hesitated. "The kind people ask when they are planning to sell." A slow heaviness settled through my chest, but strangely it no longer felt shocking. Just confirming. Like finally seeing the shape of something that had been standing in the dark for a long time. Martha lowered herself into the porch chair across from me and sighed. "At first I thought maybe Ryan and Vanessa were helping you organize things after Walter passed. Lord knows grief makes people do strange things." She looked toward the pasture where the horses moved slowly beneath the pale morning sun. But then Vanessa started asking about property taxes, mineral rights, and whether neighboring ranches had sold recently to developers. Developers. That single word made my stomach tighten harder than anything else. Walter spent half his life protecting this land from commercial buyers. Every few years somebody from out of state would offer absurd amounts of money to carve luxury homes into these hills. Walter always refused before they even finished speaking. "This ranch feeds families," he used to say. "It is not meant to become vacation property for people who think cows are decorative." Martha folded her hands together tightly. "Then last Tuesday I saw Ryan meeting with a realtor from Billings at the diner near Route 12. I stared at her quietly. "Did he see you?" She nodded once. "And he looked guilty as sin." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Wind stirred softly through the cottonwood trees beside the porch while somewhere behind the barn a gate clanged lightly against its post. Familiar sounds. Steady sounds. The kind Walter always said reminded him that life keeps moving whether people deserve it or not. Martha finally leaned closer toward me. "Helen, I hate saying this, but I think they assumed you would eventually agree to leave quietly." I almost smiled at that. Quietly. As though a woman could simply pack 42 years of marriage into cardboard boxes and disappear politely so younger people could redecorate around her absence. Before I could answer, Ryan's truck turned slowly into the driveway carrying several lumber boards in the back. Martha's expression shifted immediately. Ryan stepped out of the truck looking surprised to see her. "Morning, Miss Martha," he said awkwardly. "Morning, Ryan." Her voice stayed polite but cooler than usual. Vanessa appeared moments later in the front doorway holding her phone. The second she noticed Martha sitting beside me, something sharp flashed briefly across her face before the smile returned. "What a nice surprise," she said sweetly. Martha stood slowly from the porch chair. "I was just checking on Helen." Vanessa folded her arms loosely. "That is thoughtful of you." The tension between them sat heavy in the air even though neither woman raised her voice. Ryan carried the lumber toward the garage while avoiding eye contact with me entirely. I watched him carefully. My son looked exhausted. Not angry. Not cruel. Exhausted. Like somebody trying desperately to convince himself he was doing the right thing while every instinct underneath kept warning otherwise. Vanessa stepped closer onto the porch beside me. "Ryan is building storage shelves," she explained casually. "We figured we should organize the remaining items before winter." Remaining items. That was how she described my belongings now. Leftovers waiting to be sorted. Martha picked up her empty pie carrier but paused before leaving. "Helen," she said gently, "if you need anything at all, you call me." I nodded once. "Thank you." After she drove away, Vanessa stayed standing beside the porch railing pretending to scroll through her phone. Then, without looking directly at me, she said quietly, "People around here need to mind their own business." I turned toward her slowly. "Funny," I replied calmly. "That is exactly what I was beginning to think." For the first time since I returned home, her smile disappeared completely. And in that brief silence between us, I finally saw the truth clearly. Vanessa was no longer trying to convince me to leave. She was trying to pressure me into surrendering before I discovered how much they had already planned behind my back. That afternoon I drove into town alone for the first time since coming home. I told Vanessa I needed groceries, and she smiled too quickly before asking whether I wanted Ryan to come with me. "I can still drive my own truck," I replied calmly. The silence afterward lasted just a second too long. Billings sat about 40 minutes east of the ranch, and the entire drive there I kept replaying Walter's letter in my mind. The words felt heavier now. If you are reading this, then something in this family has gone wrong. Walter had never been dramatic. If anything, he avoided conflict whenever possible, which meant he must have seen far more than he ever told me. I parked outside Caleb Turner's office just after noon. The building looked exactly the same as it had 20 years earlier. Same brick exterior. Same narrow staircase beside the insurance office downstairs. Even the brass nameplate beside the door remained slightly crooked the way Walter used to joke about every time we visited. Caleb opened the door himself before I could knock twice. The moment he saw my face, his expression changed. "Helen," he said quietly, "I had a feeling I would be seeing you soon." He guided me into his office without another question. The room smelled faintly of leather folders and black coffee, just like Walter's office back home. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Caleb simply waited while I placed Walter's envelope carefully onto his desk. His eyes rested on the papers, and something like sadness crossed his face. "He finally gave you the letter," he murmured. "You knew about this?" Caleb nodded slowly. "Walter came to me 8 years ago after Vanessa started asking unusual questions about the ranch." I lowered myself carefully into the chair across from him. "Why did nobody tell me?" Caleb sighed heavily and removed his glasses. "Because Walter hoped he was wrong. He did not want you living in suspicion unless it became necessary." Necessary. That word settled painfully inside me. Caleb opened one of the trust documents and slid it toward me. "Legally, the ranch is protected," he explained calmly. "Nobody can force you to sell, relocate, or transfer ownership. Walter made certain of that." "And Ryan?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. Caleb hesitated before answering. "Your son has no legal authority over this property, unless you willingly give it to him." I looked down at my hands folded tightly in my lap. "They have already started moving my things." Caleb's jaw tightened visibly. "Then they are crossing lines Walter specifically prepared for." He opened another folder from the envelope and pointed toward a highlighted paragraph near the bottom. "This clause matters, Helen. Any attempt to manipulate or pressure you into surrendering control of the ranch voids inheritance rights connected to the trust." I stared at the paper for several seconds without speaking. Walter had protected me even after death. Quietly. Carefully. Without ever making me feel afraid while he was alive. Caleb leaned back slowly in his chair. I need to ask you something honestly. I nodded once. Do you believe Ryan understands what Vanessa is doing? The question sat heavily between us. I thought about Ryan avoiding my eyes while strangers carried our furniture into moving trucks. I thought about his rehearsed speeches about safety and practicality. His nervous silences every time Vanessa spoke for him. I answered slowly. My son convinced himself he was helping me because the truth would hurt too much otherwise. Caleb studied me quietly for a moment before nodding. That sounds like Walter's son. I swallowed hard against the ache rising in my throat. Outside the office window, traffic moved slowly through downtown Billings while people crossed sidewalks carrying coffee cups and grocery bags, completely unaware that my entire family was unraveling one careful sentence at a time. Caleb finally reached for a business card and slid it across the desk toward me. If they pressure you again, call me immediately. And Helen. I looked up. His voice softened slightly. Do not let them see fear. People become reckless when they believe they are already winning. I nodded once and slipped the card into my purse. Then, for the first time since returning home, I felt something stronger than grief begin settling quietly into place. Not anger. Not revenge. Clarity. And clarity Walter used to say was far more dangerous than rage. I returned to the ranch just before sunset. The sky stretched wide and orange above the hills, and for a brief moment the property looked exactly the way it always had. Peaceful. Untouched. Safe. Then I noticed the second moving truck parked near the equipment shed. My grip tightened around the steering wheel. Ryan stepped out from the garage the moment he heard my truck tires crunch across the gravel driveway. He looked nervous immediately. Mom, he said, walking toward me quickly. We were wondering where you went. I climbed out slowly and closed the truck door behind me. I went into town. Vanessa appeared behind him carrying a clipboard. A clipboard. On my ranch. We tried calling, she said lightly. Your phone was off. I did not feel like talking. Her smile flickered for half a second before returning. Well, she said brightly, you missed some progress. Progress. Another one of her polished little words. I walked past them toward the barn without asking permission or explaining myself. Inside, several shelves had already been cleared out. Walter's old tool chest was missing. So were the antique horse saddles hanging along the back wall. My pulse slowed strangely instead of quickening. The calmer I became, the more careless they seemed to get. Ryan followed me inside. Mom, please do not make this harder than it needs to be. I turned toward him slowly. Harder for who? He looked away first. That told me everything. Vanessa stepped into the barn doorway with her clipboard pressed against her chest. We are only trying to organize things before winter, she repeated. The ranch has become too much responsibility. I looked around the barn quietly. Dust floated through the evening light pouring between the wooden beams overhead. Walter built most of this structure himself 30 years ago after a storm collapsed the original roof. I could still picture him standing right here covered in sawdust laughing because he hammered his thumb 3 times in one afternoon. This place was not responsibility. It was history. Family. Memory. Interesting, I said calmly, because you seem very comfortable deciding what stays and what disappears. Vanessa's expression tightened slightly. Helen, nobody is stealing from you. Then why are my things already inside trucks? Silence. Ryan rubbed his forehead wearily. Mom, we talked about this. No, I answered softly. You talked at me. There is a difference. The barn fell quiet except for the distant sound of cattle shifting in the north pasture. Vanessa finally stepped farther inside. You are being emotional because this change feels sudden, she said carefully, almost like somebody speaking to a difficult patient. But eventually you will realize we are protecting you from making unsafe choices alone out here. Unsafe choices. I almost admired how elegantly she disguised control as concern. I reached into my coat pocket slowly and removed Caleb's business card. Ryan noticed it instantly. The color drained slightly from his face. You went to see Caleb? He asked quietly. Vanessa's entire posture stiffened beside him. I looked directly at my son. Your father asked me to trust Caleb if anything ever felt wrong. Neither of them spoke. I continued calmly. He also left very specific legal instructions regarding this ranch. Vanessa recovered first. Helen, there is no need to involve lawyers. We are family. Exactly, I replied. Which makes this even more disappointing. Ryan swallowed hard. Mom, nobody is trying to hurt you. I studied his face carefully then. Exhausted eyes. Tight jaw. Fear buried beneath denial. For the first time since all of this began, I realized my son truly had convinced himself this takeover was some kind of kindness. Vanessa stepped closer toward him protectively before speaking again. This conversation is becoming unhealthy, she said smoothly. Maybe we should all cool down tonight and revisit things tomorrow. Revisit things. As though dismantling my home was merely a scheduling discussion. I slipped Caleb's card back into my pocket and walked slowly toward the barn exit. Then I stopped beside the doorway without turning around. Nobody touches Walter's office, I said quietly. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever. The silence behind me felt heavy enough to crack wood. Then Vanessa's voice came carefully from across the barn. Helen, you should really think carefully about how difficult you want this process to become. I finally turned then. And for the first time since returning home I smiled. Not warmly. Not kindly. Just enough for her to understand something had changed. Because Vanessa still believed she was dealing with a grieving widow too exhausted to fight back. She had not realized yet that I was no longer confused. And once confusion disappears, fear usually follows right behind it. The next morning the ranch felt unusually quiet. No moving trucks. No workers. No sound of boxes sliding across hardwood floors. Even the horses seemed calmer beneath the pale gray Montana sky. I woke before sunrise and sat alone at the kitchen table drinking coffee while watching fog drift slowly across the pasture beyond the windows. For the first time in days, I no longer felt like somebody waiting for disaster to happen. I felt prepared. Around 8 o'clock, Ryan came downstairs looking exhausted. His eyes were bloodshot, and his shoulders sagged beneath his flannel jacket as though he had not slept at all. Vanessa appeared several minutes later wearing cream-colored slacks and carrying her laptop bag like she was heading into a corporate meeting instead of dismantling somebody's home. Neither of them spoke much while I cooked eggs and bacon at the stove. The silence felt brittle. Careful. Finally Vanessa set her coffee cup down. Helen, she began smoothly, Ryan and I think it would be best if we finalize a timeline today. I placed 3 plates onto the table without answering immediately. A timeline for what? Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside her. Vanessa continued anyway. For your transition into assisted living. Assisted living. Hearing the words spoken aloud inside Walter's kitchen finally removed whatever illusion remained between us. I sat down calmly across from them. I am not moving. Vanessa smiled tightly. You say that now because change is emotional, but eventually... No, I interrupted quietly. I say it because this ranch belongs to me. The room fell silent. Ryan looked down at his plate immediately while Vanessa's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Helen, she said carefully, that is not entirely accurate. I folded my napkin slowly into my lap. Actually, it is perfectly accurate. Then I reached beside my chair and placed the trust documents carefully onto the table between us. The color drained from Vanessa's face the second she saw Caleb Turner's letterhead. Ryan stared at the papers in confusion. What is this? He asked quietly. Your father's legal instructions, I replied. Vanessa recovered quickly, but her voice came out sharper now. You went behind our backs to involve lawyers? I almost smiled at the absurdity of the question. No, Vanessa. Your husband's father involved lawyers 8 years ago. Ryan looked between us anxiously. Mom, what are you talking about? I slid the highlighted trust clause toward him. He read silently for several seconds while the kitchen clock ticked loudly against the wall behind us. I watched the exact moment understanding reached his face. Inheritance rights may be permanently revoked, he read softly. His eyes lifted slowly toward Vanessa. What does this mean? I answered before she could. It means your father knew somebody might eventually try to pressure me out of this home. Vanessa pushed her chair back sharply. This is ridiculous, she snapped. We were trying to help her. By selling furniture? I asked calmly. By contacting realtors? By planning garage sales before discussing any of this with me honestly? Ryan's face turned pale. He looked at Vanessa again, but this time there was something different in his expression. Doubt. Real doubt. Vanessa, he said slowly, you told me Mom already agreed to most of this. Silence. Just one terrible second of silence. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. She implied she understood this ranch was becoming unrealistic. I looked directly at my son. Ryan, I never agreed to leave my home. He stared at the table like the floor had disappeared beneath him. Outside, wind rattled softly against the porch railing where Walter's rocking chair used to sit. Vanessa suddenly stood up. Fine, she said coldly. If Helen wants to make this difficult, then maybe we should rethink how much help we are willing to offer her in the future. I remained perfectly still. You misunderstand something, I said quietly. I am not afraid of being alone here. She picked up her bag angrily and walked toward the hallway, but Ryan stayed seated across from me looking smaller than I had ever seen him. Older somehow, like somebody waking up after years inside a fog he did not realize existed. His voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke. Mom, I thought I was helping. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. No, Ryan. You were helping somebody erase me. Tears filled his eyes instantly, but I did not comfort him. Some grief cannot be softened. Some lessons arrive too